Thank you, Madam Chair, and Senator Inhofe for holding this important hearing, and I appreciate the examination you're given to this important issue that's impacted so many people in my state and across the country. Unlike a normal disaster, such as a Hurricane Irene that occurs in a relatively brief amount of time as waters rise and then recede, and victims are able to recover and move on with their lives, the flooding in South Dakota lasted over 90 days, which displaced individuals and families from their homes and had tremendous economic impact on businesses and communities along the Missouri River. The flood started on Memorial Day and lasted until Labor Day. Many of those who had their homes damaged or destroyed never purchased flood insurance because they were told by the Army Corps of Engineers that their homes were not at risk. Now, I would categorize the Missouri River flood of 2011 as something of a hybrid between a natural disaster and a man-made disaster, and I believe that human error contributed to the creation of this particular disaster. We need to understand what human errors and existing management practices on the Missouri River occurred so that we can learn from these mistakes and make adjustments where necessary to ensure that similar disasters do not occur in the future. March 1st is a significant date for the Missouri River dam system. That is when the system needs to have a required amount of storage or empty space to be able to accumulate the average runoff from the winter snowpack. However, the Corps still had not created all of the required amount of empty space in the system on March 1. Then throughout the month of March, the empty space that had been created filled up with runoff that exceeded expectations. By March 31st, the storage space was erased. The Oahe Reservoir above Pierre and Fort Pierre was nearly 7 feet higher than expected at the end of March. Despite the rapid increase in inflow during the months of March, the Corps inexplicably did not accommodate for the additional water by increasing discharges. In April, each of the reservoirs were well above expected elevations, but the Corps did not respond with adequate discharges to compensate for the incredible inflow during February and March. This allowed the system to be near maximum capacity on May 1 and unable to store the May runoff. The main thing I want this committee to take away from the testimony is that the Corps completely failed when it came to understanding the amount of risk the snowpacks contained, which resulted in a cascading series of events that led to a much more serious flood than would otherwise have occurred. And a fundamental question I think that the members of this committee need to ask the Corps today is why didn't they release more water along the Missouri River dam system in March, April, and early May when they knew they were losing storage capacity and that snowpack and inflows were well above normal capacity? The Corps leadership frequently responds to this type of question by saying that they would have needed perfect foresight to predict the massive amount of rain in Montana during the month of May. But a lot of experts and even informed observers saw early on that severe flooding was likely coming in the spring and summer. Everybody saw it was coming and urged action to address the coming deluge, it seems, except for the Army Corps of Engineers, the entity that's charged with managing the river. It's true that some degree of flooding was going to happen in South Dakota this summer regardless of what the Corps did or didn't do. But the Corps basically thought that they could fill up the entire amount of empty space in the system by the beginning of May, gambling that the snowpack was gone and that there would be no significant precipitation in May. Because the Corps completely miscalculated on the snowpack issue, they never fully communicated what preparation and to what level was going to be needed until it was too late. So I would say, Madam Chair and Senator Inhofe, other members of the committee, going forward, flood control needs to be the top priority for the Corps, particularly in wet cycles, and this is something that I believe needs to be modified or reflected in the master manual which governs the management of the Missouri River. And I fear that the Corps is planning to move forward under the assumption that this was a one-off event. And my understanding is that they're planning to have the same amount of storage space in the system next year as they did this year. I think that's a risky proposition, as we seem to be in a wet cycle, and I hope the Corps will not simply repeat the mistakes next year or in future years that occurred this year. Keep in mind, the reservoir system along the Missouri River is not as capable for the 2012 runoff season as it was for this year as a result of the stress that the system witnessed. I've said throughout this entire debacle this past summer that the Corps of Engineers needs to be held to account for their management of the Missouri River system this year, and I hope that this hearing marks an accountability moment for the Corps. I've got my own statement that I'd like to submit entirely for the record. I also like to build on the record by submitting written statements that were provided by the Mayor of Pierre, Lori Gill, South Dakota Insurance Director Merle Schreiber, whose home was impacted by this, and by the manager of Dakota Dunes Community Improvement District, Jeff Dooley, and would ask that those statements also appear in the record. And I'll make one final observation, too, I also want to include a statement by Brad Lawrence, who is the Public Works Director for the City of Fort Pierre, who on February 1 predicted a flood of biblical proportions based upon the research that he had done at that time. His statement, his narrative, I think, is very compelling, and when you look at the arguments, the statements that he was already making at that early point in the process, it's hard to feature why we ended up where we were. Madam Chair, I thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee this morning.